You already know that feeling. You are lying there in the dark, eyes wide open, the ceiling staring back at you like an empty answer. The day is done. Your body is tired, but your mind is still running, still replaying, still spinning in circles around everything you haven't solved, everything you wish you had done differently, every dream that feels just slightly out of reach. You pull the blanket up, you close your eyes, and then it begins again, the worry, the doubt, the quiet voice that says maybe things will always be this way. Most people believe sleep is just rest, a pause, a blank space between one hard day and the next. But what if the hours between the moment you close your eyes and the moment you open them again were actually the most powerful hours of your entire day? What if the way you think in those last few minutes before sleep is quietly shaping the direction of your life, your decisions, your confidence, your results, without you even realizing it? This is the question Napoleon Hill spent decades trying to answer. And what he discovered changed the way the world thinks about the human mind. Before we go further, here is something I want you to sit with. Think about the last 10 nights before you fell asleep. What were you thinking about? Were you rehearsing your fears, or were you rehearsing your future? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. You might be surprised by what you discover about yourself. There is something almost unbearable about feeling stuck. Not the dramatic kind of stuck where everything is falling apart, but the quiet, grinding kind where you are working hard, doing what you are supposed to do, and still feeling like something invisible is holding you back. Like there is a ceiling you can see through but cannot seem to break. Like the life you want is close enough to imagine, but just far enough to feel impossible. Napoleon Hill understood this feeling better than almost anyone. He did not come from money. He did not come from privilege. He grew up in a one-room cabin in the mountains of Virginia, the kind of poverty that leaves a mark on a person. And yet he went on to study the most successful human beings of his era, people like Andrew Carnegie, Thomas Edison, Henry Ford. And he spent 20 years synthesizing what he found into one of the most studied ideas about human achievement ever written. Hill believed that success was not purely a matter of circumstance or talent. He believed that it lived first and always in the mind. And not just the conscious mind, the thinking, reasoning, calculating mind you use during the day. He pointed to something deeper, something that works while you are not watching. Hill wrote that every human being carries within them a sleeping giant, a vast, silent intelligence that operates beneath the surface of conscious thought, absorbing everything, processing everything, and quietly steering behavior in ways the waking mind rarely understands. He called it the subconscious mind. And he believed deeply, persistently, with the conviction of a man who had watched it work in hundreds of lives, that this sleeping giant could either be your greatest ally or your most consistent saboteur, depending entirely on what you fed it. Think of it this way. Imagine a river. During the day, you are on the surface rowing, steering, making choices. But beneath you, there is a current, and that current is always moving, always pulling. Most people never notice the current. They just notice that sometimes, no matter how hard they row, they don't seem to get where they are going. Hill was saying, pay attention to the current, because the current runs at night. There was a man I once read about, not famous, not wealthy, who had spent years trying to build a small business and failing in the same way, over and over again. He worked long hours. He had good ideas, but every time he got close to a breakthrough, something would go wrong, a decision he couldn't explain, a hesitation that cost him, a pattern he couldn't see. A mentor eventually asked him what he thought about every night before he fell asleep. He paused for a long time. Then he said, quietly, I think about everything that could go wrong. That one answer explained years of struggle, not because the world was conspiring against him, but because his own subconscious, faithfully fed a nightly diet of fear, had become an expert at finding exactly what he was looking for. This is where it gets interesting. In our modern world, we have surrounded ourselves with screens, notifications, and noise right up until the moment our eyes close. We scroll through disasters, arguments, and the curated highlight reels of other people's lives, and then we wonder why sleep feels like anything but rest. The last few minutes before sleep are among the most neurologically receptive moments of the human day. Researchers in sleep science have confirmed what Hill intuited nearly a century ago: the mind entering the hypnagogic state, that threshold between waking and sleeping, is uniquely open to suggestion, to rehearsal, to the kind of deep emotional imprinting that lasts. What you put in during those minutes does not simply disappear. It goes somewhere. The reframe is this: you are always programming your subconscious before sleep. Always. The question is never whether you are doing it. It is only whether you are doing it deliberately or by accident. So tonight, before you close your eyes, pause just for a moment and ask yourself, what am I choosing to hand over to the night? But even when people understand this idea in principle, something gets in the way. Something that Hill identified as perhaps the single greatest enemy of human potential. And it is not laziness. It is not lack of opportunity. It is not even bad luck. It is fear. Specifically, the kind of fear that has gone so quiet and so familiar that you no longer recognize it as fear at all. You just call it being realistic. Hill was direct about this. He wrote that fear is the most destructive force in human life, not because it protects us, but because it paralyzes us in ways we cannot always see. He identified 6 core fears that he believed plague nearly every human being: the fear of poverty, the fear of criticism, the fear of ill health, the fear of loss of love, the fear of old age, and the fear of death. And he made a provocative claim that most people, without ever making a conscious decision to do so, spend the majority of their mental life in the grip of one or more of these fears. Not screaming fears, whispering ones. Hill described the subconscious mind as something like fertile soil, completely indifferent to what you plant in it. Plant seeds of fear and worry, and it will grow fear and worry with extraordinary efficiency. Plant seeds of faith and vision and possibility, and it will grow those just as faithfully. The soil doesn't judge. It doesn't prefer one crop over another. It simply grows what you consistently sow. There was a woman I once heard about who had spent years telling herself she was just not a confident person. She believed it completely. It felt like a fact about her, as fixed and inarguable as her height. But when she started paying attention to what she was actually thinking every night before sleep, the comparisons, the self-criticism, the quiet rehearsal of her inadequacies, she realized that she was not simply an unconfident person. She was a person who had been training herself nightly for years to feel small. The moment that distinction landed, everything shifted. Not overnight, but the direction changed, because she understood, finally, that the program could be rewritten. If you have found yourself nodding along to any of this, if something here is resonating with what you have quietly lived, consider sharing this with someone you care about. Not because this video needs the numbers, but because the person in your life who needs this idea the most is probably not looking for it. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for someone else is hand them a mirror at exactly the right moment. Here is what Hill was ultimately pointing at. Fear is not the truth about you. It is a habit of thought. And habits of thought, even deeply ingrained ones, even ones that have been running for decades, can be changed not by force, not by willpower alone, but by consistently, deliberately, and patiently replacing what you feed your mind in those quiet, receptive hours before the world goes dark. The struggle is real. The fear is real, but it is not permanent. And recognizing that distinction is the first act of genuine courage. There is a practice Hill described that sounds almost embarrassingly simple when you first hear it, So simple that the mind trained on complexity immediately wants to dismiss it. He called it autosuggestion. And before you move past it, stay here for a moment, because this idea is the practical heart of everything Hill taught about the subconscious mind and sleep. Autosuggestion, as Hill understood it, is the deliberate act of speaking to your own subconscious through repeated, emotionally charged, personally meaningful statements, not recited mechanically like a bored student reading from a textbook, but felt deeply as if the thing you are affirming is already true. The distinction mattered enormously to Hill. He believed, and this is the part most people skip, that the subconscious mind does not respond to words alone. It responds to words fused with emotion. Desire without emotion is like a letter with no stamp. It never arrives. Hill wrote that the subconscious mind is influenced more by feelings than by intellectual reasoning. This is not a metaphor. It reflects something genuinely true about the architecture of the human mind. The emotional centers of the brain are older, faster, and more deeply wired into behavior than the rational centers. Every therapist, every behavioral scientist, every honest self-observer knows we do not simply think our way into new lives. We feel our way there. Think of autosuggestion as tuning a radio. During the chaos of the day, there is so much static noise, demands, other people's urgencies, your own scattered thoughts, that the signal you are trying to receive can barely get through. But at night, just before sleep, the static drops, the frequency clears. And in that clarity, what you deliberately broadcast to yourself lands with a depth and a permanence that daytime repetition rarely achieves. I once knew someone who had spent years wanting to write a novel. He had the idea, he had the talent, by most accounts, but every night, without realizing it, his last waking thoughts were some version of, "Who am I kidding? Nobody wants to read what I have to say." He never said it out loud. He barely even noticed it consciously, but it was there every night, quiet and consistent, like water wearing down stone. When he deliberately changed those last thoughts, not to forced positivity, but to something he could actually believe, I have something worth saying, and I am getting closer to saying it, well, the shift came slowly and then all at once. Within 18 months, the first draft was done. The subconscious, faithfully fed a new instruction, had simply done what it always does. It found a way. In today's world, we are saturated with productivity advice. Apps that track your habits, journals that prompt your gratitude, morning routines that promise transformation. Most of it is not wrong, but most of it is aimed at the daylight hours. Hill was pointing to something different. He was saying that the most underutilized productive hour of your entire day is the one that most people spend scrolling, worrying, or just collapsing into unconsciousness without intention. That single hour, or even those final 10 to 15 minutes, holds a leverage point that most people walk past every single night of their lives. If this idea is sitting with you, if something in you is quietly saying, "I have been wasting that time," let that recognition land gently, not as guilt, as possibility. Now, here is where Hill's thinking moves into territory that even his admirers sometimes find uncomfortable, because Hill did not stop at positive thinking. He did not stop at autosuggestion. He went further into what he called the mastermind principle, into the idea of a definite chief aim, into what he described as the mysterious workings of infinite intelligence. Now, and while some of those ideas live at the edge of what modern minds want to accept, the core insight underneath all of it is worth staying with. Hill believed that clarity of purpose was not simply motivating, it was in a very real sense magnetic. He believed that a mind which knows exactly what it wants, which holds that desire consistently and emotionally, begins to operate in ways that a scattered, unfocused mind simply cannot. Opportunities that were always present suddenly become visible. Connections that existed all along suddenly become meaningful. Actions that felt impossible suddenly feel obvious. This is not magic. Or rather, it is the kind of magic that, when you look closely enough, turns out to be psychology. The mind, given a clear target, becomes extraordinarily good at moving toward it. Not because the universe rearranges itself, but because human attention is selective, and a defined purpose radically changes what you notice, what you act on, and what you allow yourself to believe is possible. Hill's advice for the night was therefore not simply to repeat pleasant phrases and hope for the best. It was to go to sleep holding, as clearly and as emotionally as you could manage, the vivid image of the life you were building, the version of yourself you were becoming, the goal you were moving toward, not as a fantasy, as a commitment. There was a man who had lost his job in his mid-40s, the kind of loss that shakes a person to the foundation, that makes the future feel like a dark room you are not sure you want to walk into. He could have, and for a while he did spend his nights cycling through fear and regret, but at some point he made a decision. Every night, before sleep, he would spend 5 minutes holding in his mind the clearest possible image of what he was building next. Not what he had lost, what he was moving toward. It took time. It took discipline. It was not always easy to hold the image when the fear was louder. But gradually, the image became more real than the fear. And the actions that followed were simply the natural consequence of a mind that had been consistently shown where it was going. People who study high performance have long noted that elite athletes, musicians, surgeons, and performers use mental rehearsal not as a feel-good supplement, but as a core part of their preparation. The mind, research consistently shows, does not distinguish perfectly between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. The same neural pathways fire. The same emotional responses activate. The same preparations are made. Hill understood this before most of the science had been done. He just called it faith and desire and the power of the subconscious mind. The invitation here is quiet, but important. What if, tonight, you spent 5 minutes before sleep, not reviewing the day that was, but rehearsing the life that is becoming? Not performing optimism, not forcing false cheer, just holding as steadily and as warmly as you can the direction you have chosen. There is another dimension to Hill's thinking about sleep and the subconscious that does not get nearly enough attention, and it has to do not with what you do before sleep, but with what you are willing to pay attention to when you wake up. Hill was fascinated by the edge of sleep, not just the falling into sleep threshold, but the waking from sleep one. He wrote that the moments just after waking, before the demands of the day have fully crowded in, are another window of unusual clarity and creative access. He called this a time when the subconscious, having worked through the night, sometimes delivers its answers. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes as a feeling, sometimes as a sudden knowing, sometimes as a clear image or idea that seems to arrive from nowhere. Most people get out of bed and immediately check their phones. The news, the messages, the notifications, the world rushing in before they have had a single moment to receive whatever the night was quietly preparing. Hill would have said, wait, just wait. Give yourself 5 minutes in that half light between sleep and full waking, not to think busily, to receive quietly. This practice of attending to the transition between sleep and waking has been described by some of the most prolific creators in history as central to their process. Thomas Edison, whom Hill studied and wrote about extensively, was famous for his technique of sitting in a chair, holding a steel ball in each hand, drifting toward sleep, so that the moment he crossed into unconsciousness, the balls would drop and wake him, forcing him back into that fertile in-between space where his most creative thinking happened. He believed, and Hill agreed, that the subconscious mind generates its most original solutions in precisely that liminal, unguarded state. You do not need steel balls. You need only the willingness to pause before the world comes in, to lie still for a moment, to ask a quiet question before sleep. What do I need to understand? Or what is the next right step? And then trust that the night will work on it. And in the morning, before the phone, before the news, before the calendar, and the obligations to just listen for a moment, softly, without forcing, there was a woman I once heard described who had been wrestling for months with a decision she couldn't make a fork in her life where both paths felt uncertain. She had analyzed it to exhaustion, made lists, asked everyone she trusted for their opinion, and still, clarity would not come. On the advice of a friend, she tried something different. She wrote the question clearly in a notebook before sleep. She read it once, put it down, and let herself fall asleep, holding not the analysis, but just the question, open and unheld. In the morning, before she reached for her phone, she lay still, and within a few quiet minutes, the answer was simply there. Not as a dramatic revelation, as a calm, settled knowing she hadn't been able to access from the inside of her overthinking. The subconscious is not a machine that delivers results on demand. It is more like a deep well. You lower the bucket at night. In the morning, if you are patient and quiet enough, you pull it back up. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes what comes up is exactly what you needed. Hill's most lasting contribution might not be any single technique or principle. It might be the underlying conviction that ran through everything he wrote and taught the belief that the human mind, properly understood and properly directed, is capable of far more than most people will ever ask of it. Not because people are lazy or unambitious, but because most people have never been told clearly and compellingly that they are far more in charge of their inner world than they realize, and that the inner world, the quality of thought, the nature of belief, the consistent emotional tone of a person's inner life shapes the outer world more reliably and more profoundly than almost any external circumstance. This is not a comfortable idea. It asks something of you. It asks you to take responsibility not just for your actions, but for your thoughts, not just for your days, but for your nights, not just for what you do, but for the inner climate in which everything you do takes root. Hill wrote that whatever the mind of man can conceive and believe, it can achieve. It is perhaps his most quoted line, and it has been repeated so often that it has started to feel like a slogan, but beneath the slogan, there is a genuine insight that is worth recovering. Conceive means to clearly imagine, to see in vivid detail. Believe means to feel as real and possible, not just to intellectually accept as true. And achieve follows not as magic, but as the natural consequence of a mind that has been consistently, deliberately aligned with its purpose. The practice before sleep is therefore not a ritual for its own sake. It is a daily act of alignment, a way of saying, at the end of each day, before you surrender to unconsciousness, here is where I am going, here is what I believe is possible. Here is the version of myself I am becoming. And then trusting the night to do what the night does, to process, to consolidate, to prepare, to quietly move the pieces. If something in this conversation has been meaningful to you, if it has shifted something or confirmed something you already sensed but hadn't yet put into words, consider staying close to these ideas, not just for tonight, but as a continuing practice. There is something here that rewards return. Because every time you come back to this question, what am I feeding my subconscious before sleep? You will be a slightly different person with slightly different things to face, and slightly different resources to face them with. And so we come back to where we began, to that feeling of lying in the dark, mind still running, the day done, and the night just beginning. We began by calling it a problem, a restless mind, an unquiet heart, the gap between where you are and where you want to be. But here is the profound reversal that Hill's entire life's work quietly points to. That restless mind is not the obstacle, it is the instrument. The same capacity for thought that keeps you awake with worry is the very capacity, properly directed, that will quietly build the life you are reaching for while you sleep. The subconscious does not need you to be perfect or fearless or certain. It only needs you to be consistent, to show up night after night with some intention, some direction, some image of what you are moving toward, and then to let go and to rest and to trust the extraordinary, unhurried intelligence that has always been running beneath the surface of everything you think you are. Napoleon Hill spent his life pointing at this truth, not because it was comforting, though it can be, but because he had watched it work. He had sat with men and women who had come from nothing and built something remarkable, and in every case the foundation was not luck or genius or perfect timing. It was a mind that had learned gradually and deliberately to work with itself instead of against itself. Tonight, before you close your eyes, try this. Spend 5 minutes not reviewing the day, not cataloging the worries, not rehearsing what might go wrong. Instead, hold quietly in your mind the clearest, warmest image of the life you are building. Feel it if you can, not as fantasy, as a direction you have chosen. Then let it go, close your eyes, and sleep. The subconscious, faithful, and tireless, and far wiser than you know, will do the rest. If this kind of thinking speaks to something in you, if exploring the deeper layers of human potential feels like the kind of journey you want to stay on, then you already know what to do. The next conversation is waiting. And so, quietly, is the best version of you.